Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is my friend Christine DeTroy from Brunswick. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Good morning, Bruce. Good to be here.
Glad to have you here. I just want to say before we get started that this show marks the beginning of my 13th year broadcasting This Issue here in Maine. I want to thank all of you that have watched the show over the years, and especially thank the crew of volunteers that helps make this show possible. Christine, let's start out by saying that you're a longtime member of the peace movement, member of Peaceworks in the Mid-Coast area. You've been a participant in the weekly Friday vigil in Brunswick since right after 9/11, and you've also been one of the leaders in the annual Peace Fair that's created in Brunswick. So you have a really long, beautiful history of activity. You've recently written a book about your life in Germany, in northern Germany, as a young girl during World War II, during the rise of Hitler and during the time of the war. This is really an amazing book. It's called Remembering: The Years of Hiding Behind Silence. Could you tell us what that title means?
Well, exactly. It means hiding behind silence. Silence as a protector, because we could think, but we did not express our thoughts except to very few people that we felt safe with. But so silence was a curtain that hid us sometimes for safety, and also shamefully in a way because we didn't speak up.
Where can you get this book, by the way?
The book is available at Gulf of Maine in Brunswick.
Okay.
The bookstore on Main Street.
All right, very good. So tell us, please, why you decided to write this book.
Well, it actually started, first of all, the memories that I'm writing about have been very clear in my mind all these years. And I've shared them with my family, my growing family, as they were my children. But it was really when I attended Bowdoin College, starting in 1995, and then going on to beginning to write an honors project with one of my professors, that I decided to add one of my own experiences, and which had impacted really my whole life. And I wanted to be a witness, I think more than anything else, to the time, and perhaps the impressions of a child are in a way can be taken more seriously, because a child is not so much influenced by what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. You really get the message direct, not filtered. How
old were you during this period of time that the book reports about?
I was 11 years old when I visited Frau Abraham, and it goes on, of course, through the war, and then by the end of the war I was 17 years old.
So let's talk about this woman you just mentioned, Rosa Abraham, who a lot of the book is centered around. She was a Jewish woman that lived in your village, and you had a special experience with her just before she was sent off to concentration camps. Can you share that?
Yes, I will. It was sort of an unusual thing in the sense that another neighbor of mine who was a friend of Frau Abraham's asked me to visit with her, and on the way walking there she told me that Frau Abraham, being Jewish, was being deported. And I can't recall what these words really meant to me, but I could tell very quickly, first of all through her conversation, but then in the presence of the two women, that being deported was something serious and something very bad. And as I write in the book, we sat in the living room, Frau Abraham and my neighbor Frau Seekamp, and the women spoke quietly among each other. Perhaps there wasn't much conversation, but at one point they asked me to play the piano, and which I did. And I don't recall the piece, of course, but I just remember playing it, and it was just an unusual experience that I've never forgotten. We left, and I don't know, we probably did say Auf Wiedersehen, which means goodbye, But of course, Auf Wiedersehen implies that you will see that person again, and I don't know if I really concentrate on that, but in retrospect, of course, that is a very painful moment to think back whether one said Auf Wiedersehen in a thoughtless way, but those are the things. Yeah.
This really impacted you because later on in the book, you end up finding her family and even going to the concentration camp where she was taken in the Czech Republic after she was taken from your village, correct?
Yes, that's correct, yes. Although I must admit, and this is again, you know, I was a child, I thought she was taken directly from Bobswede on a train to the concentration camp. However, it has since been discovered that she first moved for 2 years to be with two sisters-in-law in the near city of Bremen, and then the 3 women together were deported.
To a concentration camp. That
yes.
you ended up visiting. But
yes.
in the book you asked the question, why didn't people defend Frau Abrahams and other Jewish people that were taken away?
Yes.
So what do you think the reason was?
Well, yeah, I mean, do I know? No, I don't know. Of course I don't know. If in many ways, I think things happened. I think by that time, by 1939, certainly it was already the war, and the whole imprisonment of thought and action by the Nazis was so strongly felt. People just did not act. It was fear for your own personal life, and I think that is probably more than anything else. It was fear of retribution for yourself, and then, you know, we say to yourself, do we save ourselves first, or do we save another person?
And also, there's probably this dynamic of, why do you want to stand out in the community if it looks like everybody else is going along with the show, right?
Sure. Although in years leading up to that, people did, you know, perhaps secretly, provide her with some foodstuffs and other materials which she was not able to get. So there was some compassion there. There was, you know, she was after all, a community member. But when it came to the police, the SS, I mean, people shrank in fear.
Yeah. There's a passage on page 47 of the book where you ask similar questions. Would you please read that? I think it's quite meaningful.
Yes, I will do that. All right. Why was there no outcry about the horror of lives lost, about hunger and pain, about the intolerable living and working conditions? Was it fear of being branded a traitor and being deported to a concentration camp, or was it a general dulling of emotions that generated this non-reaction? Was disassociation from the surrounding terror the only method that helped people cope? And I do believe that, yeah. I mean, I'm asking those questions, and I think the answers are also implied in the questions.
Right. Nazi Germany and their collaborators killed between 5 and 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. While it is clear why you featured Frau Abraham in your book, because of your personal experience with her, deeply, deeply moving personal experience, I noted, reading it, that you rarely mention the Soviet Union, other than to talk about the fear of most German families was that their sons might be sent to the Eastern Front to fight. Well, we know that 27 million people were killed in the Soviet Union during the German invasion. This is really where the Hitler Nazi army was broken. Just to compare, the United States lost 420,000 soldiers during the entire World War II. So during your time as a young student in Germany during the war, did you all of you, fellow students and parents and others, ever talk about or think about the terrible suffering that was also going on inside the Soviet Union?
Yeah. I don't, well, first of all, I know we didn't talk about it. You had to be so careful with whom you spoke anyway. But in terms of thinking about it, as you raised that question, I realized No, I did not think that much about it. There were two families in the community, actually neighbors and friends, who lost sons there. And I think I concentrated more on those two individuals. One was a young budding artist, the other one was a father of two children. And I think I concentrated on that. It was only much later that it came to the fore how many people had been killed in Russia. And just as an aside, I read a book, and I forget the name of the author, about the siege of Leningrad, 1,000 Days, I think it's called, and where, he spoke and wrote in detail about the death. And that book I read probably in the 50s, 60s, and then it came home to me how many, many people had killed, and not just soldiers, but again, families, mothers, children.
Yeah. After the war was over, the Nuremberg war crimes trials were held. Please read what you wrote about the lessons of Nuremberg.
All right. Appropriately, Nuremberg was chosen as the site of the post-World War II war crime trials. The trials began on November 20th, 1945, and were completed in the fall of 1946. Recently, as I reread the 1946 decisions of the International Court, I discovered that it not only dealt with passing judgment on and sentencing German war criminals, but extended its deliberation to establish once and for all that to plan or instigate an aggressive war is a crime under the principles of international law. The International Tribunal further decreed in response to the contention raised by most of the Nazi defendants that they could not be held legally responsible for their acts because they had followed the orders of their superiors, that having acted on the authority of a superior does not exempt a person from moral responsibility for his act.
Does not exempt a person.
Yes, does not exempt a person.
Yeah.
And that, when I read that particular paragraph, and it was in my Holocaust course at Bowdoin, that made a tremendous impression upon me. Not only looking at that time, but looking at today.
So what's the lesson you take away from that?
Okay, you have a choice. You do not have to be neither a bystander nor a participant. You are supposed to have free will. And that is something that is very, very clear to me, and it certainly is the way I try to live.
And you have a moral and ethical...
Absolutely. We have a moral choice. We have a moral choice.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, read a couple things, too, that move me in the book. You say, I believe that being part of an independent yet inclusive community was key to our emotional survival during the Nazi regime, which by the mid-30s had intruded into everyone's life. Yet wasn't our independent spirit an illusion to which we clung silently during the years of Hitler's dictatorship, the years of persecution and murder of those who were called the foreign element? And I can't help but think in this moment, as I read that last bit, of those who were called the foreign element. I can't help but think of the way many of our politicians in the United States talk about Muslims today. Do you see any link there at all?
I certainly do, exactly. And it's a frightening link. It is frightening to think that we fall into that category again of saying, okay, they're strangers, they're the other, they are not our brother, they're not human.
Yeah. And I also want to read another bit too. Yeah. How do you say your village name?
It's difficult to pronounce for Americans. Vopsvede.
Vopsvede.
Vopsvede,
Okay.
yes.
You write, why did Vopsvede abandon Frau Abraham, a woman whose fate remains a symbol of the millions of Jews who were persecuted and murdered? Was it because of anti-Semitism and a belief in Nazi tenets? Was it indifference and apathy? Was fear of the consequences of opposing the laws of the Third Reich, even in a small village like Worpswede, the force that led to moral paralysis? Again, talk about what you're saying here, or what you're asking.
Yeah. Well, I'm asking, again, people to really look at themselves, search inside of you. What parameters do you have in your life? Are you going to be, is it on the inside or is it on the outside? Do you have to save yourself? Very, very, very difficult questions. Very difficult questions. And again, it's something that I don't think I can say to somebody, do this, do that. It starts with me.
By your own moral compass and
exactly,
by your own example.
Yeah, and it is example more than words, I think, that make a difference.
When you first came to this country, it didn't take you long to get involved in. You were involved in the civil rights movement and things like that, so you kind of jumped in fairly early, didn't you? I
did. Actually, the first thing that startled me when I came to this country, and it was within weeks, was hearing the word segregation. I knew English quite well, but I certainly did not know the word segregation, which startled me because I had heard about the Bill of Rights, which was waved in front of us. And suddenly I discovered, well, no, it may be Bill of Rights, but it's written down, but it's not really accepted as part of, let's use the word, moral compass.
So you marched with Martin Luther King at one time?
I did, indeed, yes. And actually my first awareness was the McCarthy years. And to tell you the truth, I thought I was back in Germany.
You did?
Yeah, because the persecution of, guilt by association, I mean, that's what we grew up with. And suddenly it reared its ugly head here, and wow, yeah, I did speak up. I was fearful when I first came across it, but I never hesitated to speak my mind, not as, to verbally abuse anybody, but to say, no, I don't agree with this at all. This is not the way to live.
Were you at all reluctant because you had come from Germany and now you're in America? Did you ever feel the pressure that, who are you to say anything?
Yeah, well, obviously that thought was there, but it didn't stop me. And I remember a number of interchanges of saying to people, okay, here I'm coming from a background where abuse was it, and silence and hiding and being afraid and all that. But it was never an excuse for me to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I was really moved about in the book was when you were about, I think, 14 years old. Your town was near the big city of Bremen, and at one point you were going to school in Bremen, and you would have to take the train to Bremen, and they were bombing Bremen at the time. That must have been a frightening thing for you to be back and forth on the train in the middle of a war where the big cities in Germany were being bombed.
Yeah, it was frightening. But then I think in some ways, I think at age 14 you have this feeling nothing's going to happen to you. I think that was one thing. And the fact that my mother believed that I could do this, well, I did it. I didn't feel pressured in a sense. I didn't feel punished or ordered around. I was just part of having a confidence of a child.
Well, you briefly mentioned in the book, not enough as far as I'm concerned, but you mentioned briefly meeting your husband at the end of the war. He was an American soldier, I believe. Can you share a bit about how you met and then which led you to come to America?
Yeah, well, it was, I was invited to tea through a friend who knew this group of Americans who were stationed in Osterholz-Scharmbeck. It was it sounds terrible, but it was a counterintelligence corps group. Okay, they wore uniforms, but no indicating of what rank they had. And they were a mixture of American soldiers and also British. And I was invited there for tea or crumpets, whatever, on a Sunday afternoon, and I went. And this is where I met my husband, Pete. And somewhere along the line, we just clicked, and that was it.
And so he later was transferred to another part of Germany.
That's right. He was transferred to southern Germany, to Oberammergau. And then by that time, I guess we were quite in love, and I followed him and worked at the camp as in the drafting room doing artwork and stuff. Yeah.
And then you moved to America. What year did you come to the United States?
I came in June of 1947, and at that time was quite an upheaval still in Europe. Nothing was settled really. The war was over, but there were a lot of tensions, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I remember, leave taking was not easy for my family because we really didn't know whether another war would not break out and we'd ever see each other again. But the pull to be with my future husband was stronger than anything.
Yeah.
And off I went.
Well, you've spent, as I said earlier, your adult life as a peace activist here in the United States. As you look at our country today, where we're doing endless war and the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, the U.S. shock and awe attack of Iraq in 2003, always makes me think of the word blitzkrieg.
Yes, sure.
When Hitler invaded Poland, our war where we took down Libya, and Libya is now a mess, the U.S.-NATO war in Libya, and now what the U.S. and NATO are doing in Syria, and more. Do you see any similarities in this country today and the Germany you lived in as a young girl?
The similarities I see is that the issue of war, first of all, is overwhelming, and people assume that they really can't do anything. But a deeper concern of mine is nationalism. It is nationalism that makes people, fall into rank and file. You're going to support your country, right or wrong, my country. And that stops all thinking, and stops compassion, and stops courage, probably. And because you don't want to be the outsider. Other people are outsiders. You don't want to be an outsider.
Everybody wants to be liked and accepted, right?
Exactly, yeah. And you want to be safe. You want to be safe. Yeah. Then I think a lot about 1984, the protagonist, who, to be safe, says almost anything. Yeah.
And when you hear the politicians speak today, that are really pumping up the hatred, what do you hear?
What I hear is really a person who is, has very, very low self-image of themselves, because you would not demonize anybody else to that extent unless you yourself feel demonized. I think it goes that deep. And I think we need to be aware of that. People, when the more screaming and shouting there is, they want to be heard because they feel they're not heard. And it is for us, not with silence, but with quiet words, to bring a semblance of balance back.
Well, Christine, this is really a wonderful book. It's called Remembering: Years of Hiding Behind Silence, by Krista Miners, DeTroy, and it's available at the Gulf of Maine bookstore in Brunswick. I'm not sure how much time we have remaining. Can we get a time check here? Oh, okay. We have about 5 minutes left. Okay. So anything you want to say about?
I want to say something. Well, two things. I want to say something about using my name, Krista Miners. I was baptized Christine, but I was always called Krista, and Miners is my maiden name. And since the original memories were experienced by Krista, I decided to use that name as the writer. The other thing I want to mention is the cover page was a photograph of my mother's. And she was a nature photographer, and then the outer frame is by my son Matthew. But most of all, the book for me also represents bringing my mother and other people back into the presence, that their impact on our lives is still felt, And that to me is really very important. Yeah.
Your mother was a single mother. You had
Yes.
2 sisters.
Yes.
And your mother was a professional photographer and raised you all. Your father and your mother had been divorced at a very young age for
Yes.
you. So during a war, when things were tight, I imagine it was very difficult for her to be raising these 3 girls on her own.
Yeah, she did. Since she worked, was also often away from home on trips. We always had a housekeeper, and that was important. So we had a home life that was really basically quite balanced and safe and so on. Yeah, and a lot of good memories are in this book, as well as, you know, pointing to what can happen to people and the horrors and the fear.
So just to kind of wrap it up, at the end of the book you tell the story about helping to establish a park in your village to be named after this Jewish woman, Rosa Abraham. Can you tell that story briefly?
Yeah, it came about because I had... of course, I had shared a little bit of my stories in Sweden, which were not at first accepted all that well, because people said, "Why are you trying to raise these issues?
Why are you digging up the past?"
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Okay, digging up the past are not good. And I have translated all of my essays, so they were in German, and they're going to be published actually this coming summer in German. But yeah, so I had, you know, knowledge about Frau Abraham was resurfacing to some extent, and then it was a small foundation in the community which decided to on this park, and they invited me to come to the opening, and that was very amazing. And in my words to the assembled group during the dedication, I said, well, Frau Abraham has returned to Bobswede.
That must have been a really moving moment.
That was a very moving moment, yes. Yeah. And it's something that I never expected. Yeah. Just as I never really expected to write the book. Things happen, and you have a sense of, well, do it. And you do it.
I would imagine that you also wrote this book for your children and your grandchildren.
Yes, I did indeed, yes. But I think not just specifically for them. I really... So I said, I want to be a witness to the time. We must not forget that, not in order to dig things up, but to be aware. I mean, awareness, awareness, awareness. And then you have choices. You have choices.
So that we see our present moment more clearly, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And awareness right now, what is going on in the United States with the Middle East. We get enough reports, we can read it, but we can think about it and do something about it also in our own small way, but collectively in a big way. Yeah.
Just a few, maybe less than a minute left. Anything you want to say in conclusion?
Yes, I thought this morning about, you know, it was an unusual upbringing in the community where I grew up. And then I said to myself, why was it that, you know, was so unusual? One thing I really focus on is the fact that I grew up without a lot of competition, in the sense that I didn't have to be better than anybody, nobody had to be worse than I am, and that, I think, led to an acceptance and appreciation of other people, wherever they came from. And I didn't have to demonize anybody. I was never asked in any way to demonize anybody, not to avoid belief in what is right or wrong, but for yourself.
Yeah. Well, Christine DeTroy, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this book, Remembering Years of Hiding Behind Silence. Thank you very much.
I thank you.
And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.